You're listening to the Otis Jiry channel.
Part 2. This is not pleasant to write, and while I appreciate that it is providing the people here with entertainment, I really must ask that you allow me my moments of respite from my memory. They're rare enough, even without a sight full of readers clamoring to see those memories in print. Nevertheless, I must go on. The story is worth telling, if only to see if what I suspect to have happened to me is in any way plausible when I re-examine the facts. In any case, I must go on, so let's not waste any time. As I said before, the day I received that miserable little dream journal was Christmas Eve. Now, having to spend Christmas Day with very little sleep would have been bad enough. Having to spend it with the awful image of that swirling abyss of vermin was its own form of nightmare. My little sister, Grace, seemed to have been completely rested and wanted to play with every single toy under the tree. This would not have bothered me, except she insisted I join her, and what little energy I had was painfully defunct within very little time. Eventually I swatted her away and scolded her for not leaving me be, and retreated to my room, where I couldn't stop myself from staring at that one single frantic word so desperately scrawled in my dream journal. I considered telling Mom and Dad, but they would have probably said exactly what I'd hoped was true, that I'd done it in my sleep and only thought it frightening because I hadn't been conscious. I considered throwing the book away, too, but perhaps due to some twisted curiosity about whether the experience would repeat itself, I decided against this, at least for the time being. Even at 10, I rather enjoyed puzzling out mysteries. Moreover, much as I was terrified of the idea of the boy from my nightmares writing to me in my dream journal, I did manage to overcome my fear long enough to ponder the implications. Was the sad boy real? If so, did that mean I was sharing a dream with someone else? Perhaps even with someone who was in at least as much pain as I was. If so, did that mean that we might be able to communicate and find some way to make the nightmares end together? And why this boy? What made him special? I tried to focus on productive questions like this, mostly because I didn't want to think about the prospect that some part of my own mind might be begging for help, or worse, that I might be the victim of a ghostly or demonic visitation. So, perhaps foolishly, I held on to the dream journal. In fact, when I had worked up enough courage, I decided to try an experiment. So before I went to bed that night, I opened the journal to the page with the word help on it, and wrote under it, with immaculate penmanship, another word. How? If the sad boy could communicate through the journal, I reasoned, this should have allowed me to communicate right back. I turned out to be right in the worst possible way. The dream I had that night was, if possible, even more terrible than the one I had had the night before. In it, the sad boy was in the same rickety, worthless bed, but this time he wasn't asleep. He was tied to it with crude leather straps, and his mouth was gagged so he couldn't speak. He was entirely naked and covered in bleeding sores on every part of his body. What was worse was that this time I knew, somehow, that he could see me. But that wasn't the worst thing of all. The worst thing of all was the third occupant of the room, the thing beside his bed. From a distance, it would have looked like a shadow, but up close, I could see what it really was, a gigantic, humanoid form made entirely of writhing, chittering bedbugs, every one of them fat with blood that must have come from the sad boy himself. It stood a good 7 feet tall, and though it lacked a face that I could see, I knew with the certainty that only dreams could bring that it was happy to see me. It wanted me here. It was going to show me something terrible, and I could feel the awful sadistic pride radiating from it as it stared at me. It was the sort of pride I'd once seen on my sister Grace's face, when she'd shown me how cleverly she'd worn the wings off a butterfly. Naked, irrational passion for destruction and pain. The sad boy made a noise through his gag, and I could tell that he was trying to beg me once more to help him. I opened my mouth to speak, and as I did, a single word escaped my lips without my even noticing. How? At that, a voice filled my head, a voice that made me crouch to the ground and cover my ears in shock and disgust. It sounded like a whirring blade pressed against a stone, more like the chewing and squealing of thousands of rats devouring a corpse, or like a swarm of wasps exiting their hive. It was all of these things and none of these things, though it carried their unbearableness into every syllable it spoke. And this is what it said. You were invited. We're going to play. I shook my head and opened my mouth to protest, but once more, the only sound I could make was that single word. How? The voice gave a shrill, rattling chuckle. You're going to play doctor. You like to play doctor, don't you? You're going to do an operation. I didn't want to respond, and I clenched my jaw shut. The thing gave me an irritated burbling and buzzing noise, and raised what must have been an arm. I said you're going to do an operation. I was caught off guard as my muscles instantly disobeyed my mind, and my mouth opened to expel the word how again. That same rusted iron chuckle boomed. You're going to get me his guts. I tried to clench my mouth shut, but all the impulse did was make it open wider, and this time I shouted that awful word. How? The thing pointed one skittering appendate down at my hand, and suddenly I felt a wooden handle in it. I looked down to see that a knife had materialized in my hand. With that, you're going to use that to get me his guts. How? Oh, how I hated that word. How I wished I could sew my own lips shut. But my lips stayed stubbornly open as if they were on a puppet string, controlled by that awful thing. Then the worst thing of all happened. The thing closed with me, its body flowing and crawling more than stepping, yet still reforming with every progression. Eventually I could feel that awful, biting, scratching, gnawing bulk close to me, and I felt one of its arms reach out and wrap around my arm, snaring it like a tentacle from some monstrous sea creature. All at once my mouth snapped shut as I heard the vicious buzzsaw voice in my mind. Like this. And then it pushed me to the bed, and I was cutting, as the screams and imploring, choked-out sobs of the sad boy filled my ears. I was crying, sobbing, praying that I would wake up, but the nightmare went on, until finally, having extricated a full foot of the sad boy's intestine, something within me snapped, and I threw my head against the dream room's wall, blasting myself awake and ending the nightmare instantly. It took me a good half-hour of shuddering, crying, and hugging my teddy bear before I was willing to so much as look at the dream journal. But when I did, The same panicked scrawl, this time flecked with what looked like blood, greeted me. This time the words were far worse. "I hate you.